Hello and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Jann Alexander, author of Unspoken. Jann, welcome.
Thank you. I'm equally thrilled to be here, Colin. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, let's start with some of the history here. I know most folks are probably familiar with the Dust Bowl, but you reference a specific part of the Dust Bowl, and that is Black Sunday. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was?
Black Sunday was a storm that came on April 14th, 1935. So actually a little over 90 years ago this month. And it was, it arrived during a decade of dust storms, and people were very acquainted with dust storms by then. They started in earnest in 1931. And they particularly affected the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles where I set my novel. And when the Black Sunday storm rolled in, the sky literally turned black, whereas before the dust storms had been red or brown or colors that people ascribed to different states' soil flying toward them. And it was just really alarming to have a day that just turned black as night, and it lasted maybe 6 or 8 hours. And it was really the pivotal event of the whole decade of dust storms that got the nation to pay attention to what was happening in that area, in that era, and in that area. It was, of course, we were in the middle of the Great Depression then, and the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles were rural, and they were mostly farmers with small towns supporting them. And you have to remember this is before not just internet, but a lot of them didn't even have telephone service. Um, and so I think today how horrifying it is that it took that long for DC to really get the word on, and the government to get the word on how bad it had gotten and how federal intervention was needed. But the Black Sunday storm would have been horrifying to live through and survive. And many people who did live in that time period, if they were elderly or very young or their lungs were compromised in some way, they would come down with dust pneumonia and probably wouldn't survive it or would have lifelong lung issues too. So,
Well, I definitely want to talk a little bit more about the history, but before we do, let's talk about the way you bring this history to life with your characters, Ruby and her mother Ella May. Tell us a little bit about them and the circumstances they live under within the dust storm.
okay, that's a great question because they're the two people you hear from in the novel. Mostly you hear from Ruby Lee, and then her mother, Willa May, you hear from her from time to time, also in shorter chapters. Um, but they were a family that I felt was pretty typical of the Dust Bowl farmers in Texas, where they had toughed it out. They had arrived there um, when wheat was booming, and it was the boom crop that everybody wanted. And in addition, um, there was an unnatural amount of moisture in those years in the 20s. And they had arrived there then, and they felt like they were going to make a go of it on their farms. And then drought and wind and dust storms started up in the 30s. And I felt that Ruby Lee Becker was a pretty good example of a spunky Texas girl who would have lived in that time. She was born at a time when she knew nothing else really but the dust storms, except for maybe early childhood memories of when it was different. And her mother, on the other hand, was an educated woman who had come from Chicago and ended up, falling in love with a man who was wedded to the farm and the soil and the earth. And so there she was. And I think her journey was also pretty typical of women of the era in which um, their needs were not really being met, but nobody really wanted to deal with their problems. And they were tasked with taking care of the whole household, the family, the children, and keeping them fed and in clothing and, even in school when at a time when it's the depression and the dust storms and there's just no way to make a go of it or do all that. Um, and in Ruby Lee's case, she was pretty typical of a child who would get dust pneumonia. And in this case, she had to be sent away. That's what gets the novel started. She has to be sent away to Waco, where there aren't any dust storms to just recover her health. Um, and so I really felt like telling their two stories would be the best way to get into what it was like to live through it. And I know we all know about the Dust Bowl, but we all think of it, correct me if I'm wrong, but we all think of it as Grapes of Wrath, which we learned about from the John Steinbeck novel. And those people upped and left and went to California. And then the other thing we know about it is the famous photograph called Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange. Those are probably the only two things most people have taken away from studying the Dust Bowl. And again, that migrant mother was in California, where she and her family had gone for work that they couldn't get anyway. And so I just thought it was much more interesting to tackle the idea of how did people survive if they stayed? And what would it mean to stay? And what would it take? And what sacrifices would you be making as a family, as a human being? How could you make it work?
Can you talk a little bit about the mother-daughter relationship there? You mentioned that photo, migrant mother, a mother clinging to her, I don't know if it's two daughters. Um,
Uh-huh.
Talk about highlighting that relationship amidst all these challenges and how that helps you really show how strong it was and how important it was.
Great question. I don't want to give away a lot of the novel, except for that I'll give away this part. It's not long until Ruby Lee is separated from her mother because she has to go somewhere where she can breathe and live, which is a source of conflict in the family because her mother, Willa May, is against it. She doesn't think it's a good idea to be separated from her daughter. And her mother also is in the middle of an emotional breakdown, having lost her own mother and her baby daughter on the same day. And then she's about to lose Ruby Lee. And so when Ruby goes to Waco, she ends up in a pretty, not intentionally, but through circumstances without anybody's control, she ends up in a pretty common situation that happened with children during the Great Depression. If their parents couldn't take care of them, they took them to what were called state homes. And they weren't orphanages. They were state homes that were intended to just take care of children who were neglected or their parents couldn't take care of them. And a lot of parents intended for that to be a short-term situation. When they got back on their feet again, they'd go get them. But the reality was most kids just ended up aging out there till they were 17 and they were turned out, into society because their parents never really did make it back. So that was a pretty common thing that happened, not just in Texas, but all around the country. But I just found like that was a great vehicle for Ruby Lee to have some experiences to find family when all she really longs for is her own family. She can maybe find family there. And at the same time, another common thing that happened was all over the country again. But if women were found to be hysterical, they could be put in insane asylums, and they frequently were. It didn't take much to get people committed in those days. And so, in Willa May's case, although she's desperate to go find her daughter and track her down, forces conspire against her and she can't. So the relationship is very much of Willa May trying to constantly keep her memories alive of her daughter and in hopes of one day finding her again. And Ruby Lee determined to find her family and remake her family, but angry as all get out at her mother for what she perceives as abandoning her. So they'll both have to address all that in order for the novel to end satisfactorily and their
Mhm.
lives to move on. Yeah.
Well, let's move on to the setting itself. You live in Texas. I assume you feel a strong connection to that history. What was the value to you to research this, read about the experiences of these people, and then to provide this story for others to learn about what they went through?
I am an East Coast native, and I didn't come to Texas till a little over 20 years ago. And I came to Austin, and I immediately felt like I was a stranger in a strange land. So everything was so different in Texas. Then, I mean, I was widely traveled all up and down the East Coast and around the country, but there I'd never really experienced anything like Texas. So I turned to a thing I love to do to figure places out is which start researching it, reading about it. I volunteered for a while at the State History Museum and learned a little bit about it. And I eventually got hooked on the wacky history that Texas has. I mean, there could be a million books about actual true events in Texas, but the Dust Bowl was of particular interest to me ever since I had seen a movie that Woody Guthrie starred in. Um, David Carradine starred in as Woody Guthrie, and it was called Bound for Glory. And Woody Guthrie, the great singer-songwriter, had lived through the Dust Bowl in Texas himself and had experienced the Black Sunday storm. And so there was a scene in the film Bound for Glory that showed what it looked like when a dust storm was coming in and encroaching on a tiny little one-story town. And it stuck with me. So I just started researching that part of Texas. I was shocked to learn it was the epicenter of the Dust Bowl. And I was equally shocked to learn that a lot of Texans who are natives here didn't really know much about it. If they spent time on the east in the eastern part of Texas, they didn't really know much about it. So eventually I just felt like I wanted to write about that part of Texas and set my stories in the Texas Panhandle. I made up a town, based on a bunch of real towns that are there, and it's called Heartless.
It's a good name.
Well, the basis of it is that it's Hartley County, Hartley. So I didn't think it was too far-fetched that they might
Hmm.
have a town called Heartless.
Can you talk a little bit about the environmental impact? I studied the Dust Bowl years and years ago. I'm assuming it was over farming and not enough trees or something like that. What was the solution? And then where are we today? I mean, we have all kinds of issues with wildfires and desertification, and I don't know where the aquifer is at, what the water table is like nowadays. Have people forgotten about how important it is to keep track of that stuff and make sure it doesn't happen again?
Yes, in my opinion. I mean, I don't cover that in this novel, but I do intend to write my way into it in my maybe fourth or fifth novel. I have two other novels now in the series that are being published in September and then another one in next May. But the really a funny little sketch about where the Dust Bowl, how the Dust Bowl began to happen is that all the prairie grasses uh, in the Midwest and in Texas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest in general had been, gradually removed so that farming could happen. And this was after buffalo had been killed off, and they were the ones who had kept these native grasses in perfect tune with nature for centuries. And once they were killed off, and then farmers started farming there, they started ending up removing, little by little. They didn't know about really good soil conservation methods in those days. So they started removing the nutrient-rich topsoil, crop by crop, and so eventually they all relied on rain. They didn't have irrigation particularly back then either. And so we're talking about the 1910s, 20s. And eventually, though, a drought came along, and because if you can picture the 100th meridian, that it slices through through the middle of Texas, actually. And so everything west of the 100th meridian is considered desert, where rainfall is less than 20 inches a year, and that's not enough to really make a go of it with crops most times. And so when a drought came along to minimize even that little amount of rain, and then the winds are a constant on the plains in the plain states. And so the winds, of course, picked up, and the topsoil, which was all gone by then, began to blow. And the more it happened, the more farmers abandoned their lands. And once they abandoned their lands, there was more topsoil to blow. And it happened, throughout the Plain States, a little bit in Colorado, a little bit in New Mexico, a lot in the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles. And there had been a lot of speculators who had gotten involved and bought up land, and then they left and left a tenant farmer um, to keep the crops growing. Well, the tenant farmers up and left because they couldn't keep the crops going in the drought, and so they weren't getting anywhere. So the suitcase farmers, meanwhile, just either gave up their land to the banks or abandoned it, whatever they did. So it was more and more. It just built on, year after year after year. It got worse and more abandoned land and farms. More and more of it blew. So that's pretty much what got it started. And the only way it really came to an end, it was a slow period of the federal government intervening. That it's funny that Black Sunday storm was the kickoff. A couple of people had been trying to get a soil conservation program going, and Congress had just ignored it. But when the Black Sunday storm happened, within 2 weeks, they had a Soil Conservation Act on the president's desk. It was Franklin Roosevelt was president, and he signed it, and that started and that enabled all the states to have set up soil conservation districts. They were, had government funding so that they could staff them, and then they would begin to plan with farmers and other people the best practices and uses of the land and the management of it. And as that took hold over the rest of the 1930s and early 1940s, the rain came back finally in around 1939 or 1940. And then, it still would have been a problem, except for with World War II advances, the technology got to be such that they could then drill much deeper wells. So that brought a real run on let's all drill deep wells down into the aquifer. There's unlimited water down there, they all said. It'll never, we'll never use it up. And it may run, I don't know if it runs under parts of Minnesota, but the Ogallala Aquifer is a huge aquifer. And it encompasses parts of Texas, Oklahoma, all the way up into the Dakotas, Kansas, all the plain states. They all rely on that aquifer. And they have been slowly using up all the water, which is not recharging nearly fast enough. And so that's going to be a problem in the future. They know it's a problem, but that doesn't, it's kind of like the water problems in the West. They know they're losing water, but can they get together to solve it? No, they just can't seem to.
Yeah, it's too bad. It just seems like another environmental issue to add to the list. But
Exactly. And droughts are getting that 100th meridian line, the desert line, has been creeping east since 100 some odd years ago when it was all
mm.
discovered and discussed. So, yeah, it's another big problem everybody's facing.
Well, I wanted to ask you a little bit about photography. A lot of great photos, just amazing photos came out of the Dust Bowl, just where you see those giant black clouds and the
Hmm.
farmer running in his little tiny house is just a speck. And you yourself do a lot of photography. Do you have a favorite photo from the Dust Bowl? And can you tell us a little bit about your own creativity as a photographer?
I think that's what drew me a lot to researching this project is because I've been a photographer and I've really loved photographing places and uh, places, maybe places that are being abandoned or places that are likely to be abandoned, I guess. I kind of like the preservation angle of it. And during the Dust Bowl era, there was actually a New Deal program to put artists, writers, playwrights, photographers to work. It's hard to imagine, but there was a program, the Federal Arts Project is what it was called, and the photographers, all those photographs you see are really from those federally employed photographers, like Dorothea Lange, she was one of them, who who were set out around the country to photograph how people were living and what was going on. So I found because I have this visual sense that if I looked up old photographs, I would have a much better idea of how to write my story. And the Library of Congress has all of these photographs available. They're copyright free because all of the photographers worked for a government program when they made the photos. So there are some really remarkable ones there, but I'm particularly fond of the ones that were made by Dorothea Lange and Margaret Burkwhite, probably because they're female photographers in a time where it was pretty rare to have females employed and as photographers. And I just used an awful lot of those photos constantly, and I've used them. I do presentations on the hidden history of the Texas Dust Bowl, and it's just filled with all these great photographs and video imagery and just maps and all of the things that illustrate what's going on in that era, all of which really inspired me.
And can you tell us a little bit about your own work? I saw you have the Vanishing Austin photography series.
Yeah, I moved to Austin in 2004, and I had left Arlington, Virginia, where I had noticed all the really cool older buildings and old places were being displaced by the coming of the metro, and where suddenly the property was so valuable that they'd sell out, and then big high rises would go in. And when I moved to Austin, I began to notice that it was it was on that track. And Austin has a really rich, vibrant culture of arts and music, and has had forever, and really attracted creative people. And so I just thought all the cool old businesses that had been there for a long time, and they had great neon signs, and I'm a huge fan of neon. So I just thought, this is going to go the way of Arlington. I'm going to start photographing it before it is gone. And so I ended up making maybe 100 photographs, and people did care about it for a while. And then eventually, people moved here that had never known what it was like before, and they didn't care so much. But anyway, it's kind of near and dear to my heart.
I think that's great. Well, you said this is a series we're talking about Unspoken. Do you want to tell listeners what the next book in the series is about?
Yeah, it's a very loosely connected series in that I'm not doing it as a linear series so much as I'm creating the inhabitants of a town, Heartless, and telling their stories. And the threads of all these people, eventually are coming together. The second story is more contemporary. It's called Vacancy. And it was actually inspired by two articles I read when at the time I was visiting Arlington, Virginia. I was reading the newspaper, and there were two, back in the days when we read newspapers, not that long ago, 2005. But there were two articles on the front page of the Metro section that just really blew me away, because one was a terrible, terrible tragedy in which the people of the small town were already pointing fingers. And the other was an incredible journey of two people who had parted ways in high school, and then discovered much later in life that they were near each other, and they connected again. So I just thought the contrast between these two stories would make a great novel. So that's what Vacancy really is about bringing this terrible tragedy into perspective, and into me creating characters who could have been involved in it and how they would have reacted or handled it. And also creating another character who, was at a loss and until she found someone again. And so it's really a story about people with you know, there are a number of minor characters with supporting roles, and they all kind of gather at a little motel on the edge of town called the Jack of Diamonds, which always seems to have a vacancy. And so it's just a representation of the vacancy in their hearts until they can, find family and find second chances. And the third novel in this series is called Overdue, and it's a companion novel to Unspoken in that it tells the story of Ruby Lee's brother, who has taken her to Waco and isn't really real eager to go back to the farm, which he thinks is a dead end, and would much prefer to go to college, but he doesn't have any money for college. And so it's the story of his journey, a coming of age story of his journey to figure out how he's going to get the college education he wants without being able to go to college. And while the guilt and the burden weighs on him of not being back at the farm, which is not really his dream, but his father's dream.
Well, those sound like two more wonderful stories, Jan.
Thank you.
Congratulations on Unspoken. It's really been a pleasure to learn all about the Dust Bowl and about these characters, and I hope it has just continues to do well with readers.
Thank you. I really appreciate hearing that too. I like hearing how blown away they are by little known historical, parts of history. And I know you can relate to that because you you yourself have
Yeah.
done a lot of that in your own research and writing. Yeah.
Well,
So
yeah, it's important work to bring these stories to life and continue to allow us to, as we talked about a little bit, they're relevant for to today and just so valuable to help people engage with those histories.
yeah, I agree. There is always relevance for today, and you can always my themes, which tend to be about found family or finding family or what is home, those are very common themes that you see people really thinking about and working towards today. So
Hmm.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. It's great to talk to a kindred soul.
Thanks, Jan.
Thank you.